Kalispera from Athens. Kalimera in the US. Thank you all for your participation tonight. We have a huge audience, an unprecedented audience, as is the adjective used these days for the pandemic. You know, when the crisis came upon us and CYA lost all its students overnight, we thought we should create another forum by which we could pass on to others the wisdom that many of the people associated with this school have. And indeed, between our faculty, our former faculty, our alumni, our trustees, our advisors, and students, there are very many who have a lot of collective wisdom to offer to the world. So this is how the idea of this lecture series was born. And it doesn't always have to be lectures. It can be other things. It can be walks through Athens, following the footsteps of the ancient traveler, not ancient, but the early travelers, or culinary walks through modern Athens. And these are features that will follow. We aim to have one such event every 15 days. So stay tuned for the next one. We bring this service to the global public in celebration of the oldest study abroad program in Greece, and wish all our viewers safe passage during this tormented time. We hope to see you all in Greece soon as our students, our friends, and our visitors. This presentation can be regarded also as CYA's prelude to the bicentennial of the Greek state, which will be celebrated next year, since 1821 was the year of the beginning of the Greek War of Independence. What more appropriate than to take a look at the two great eras of Hellenism, classical Greece, and the beginning of modern Greece, which is what we are going to do today. Let me say a few words about our speakers. Nanno Marinatos is a professor at CYA and a professor emerita of classics and Mediterranean studies at the University of Illinois. Her main areas of research and publication are Greek religion, Minoan religion, history of scholarship, Thucydides, and Herodotus. Nanno goes a long way back at CYA. She started teaching at CYA in the fall of 1983. She's been here longer than I have, and that's an achievement. Nanno. And she was teaching here until 2004. She then left, went to the United States, looking for greener pastures, where she taught at the Department of Classics and Mediterranean Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where she was later appointed chair at the Department of Classics. At CYA, where she came back to, and we're very glad to have her here again, she's teaching 2 advanced seminars on Thucydides and on Homer. She has published extensively, and her most recent books are one on Sir Arthur Evans and Minoan Crete. That was published in 2015. And then another one on Akrotiri in Thera in the East Mediterranean, again published in 2015. Our other speaker, who will transport us to modern Greece, is Thanos Veremis. He's a professor emeritus of political history at the University of Athens and the founding member of ELIAMEP, the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy. He has been all kinds of things. Let me enumerate a few, Thano. He research associate at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. He was a visiting scholar at the Center for European Studies at Harvard. He was a visiting professor at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton. That was in the 80s. Then a visiting fellow at St. Anthony's College, Oxford in the 90s. He was Constantine Karamanlis Professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts, and more recently, President of the National Council of Education of Greece from 2004 to 2010. He has published many books on modern Greece, and his most recent one is a book on the Balkans, A Modern History of the Balkans, Nationalism and Identity in Southeast Europe. He began teaching at CYA in 1998, I believe, and he has served on the Board of Trustees of CYA, and then he's now a Trustee Emeritus. At CYA, he taught 3 courses, I believe: the Balkans in Our Times, Greek History, and Understanding the Crisis in Greece and Europe. Our discussion tonight will we'll have a moderator and a respondent, and that is Rosa Vasilaki, who is a sociology professor at CYA. Rosa joined CYA in 2019 and is teaching sociology of dissent. That's a course at CYA, sociology of dissent, and politics of identity in modern Greece. She's a teaching fellow at the Department of Social Anthropology at Pantheon University of Social and Political Sciences in Athens. She has taught history and sociology on the graduate and undergraduate levels and conducted research in a number of universities in Greece, Israel, and the UK. Her main research interests revolve around the changing roles of religion in modernity and the manifestations and genealogy of violence in the modern world. She currently supervises a research project on hate rhetoric. How do you like that? Hate rhetoric. And political violence in Greece, and works on a book on the legacy of colonialism. I don't have anything further to say, but I want to pass the floor on to her. But before I do that, I want it to be known that this session is recorded, and the discussion will be recorded and archived for CYA's future use. Those who might prefer not to be recorded should please switch off their video cameras. Thank you. Rosa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Phylactopoulos. Before giving the floor to our guest speakers, I would like to go over some administrative info. Throughout the discussion, you can submit your questions using the chat box on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please send your questions to me. As soon as both speakers have concluded their contributions, we will get to as many questions as we can. For those of you who are watching us through Facebook Live, you may also submit your questions using the comment section, and we'll try to get to those ones as well. As a reminder, a recording of this discussion will be sent out to all the registrants within 48 hours after the lecture, and it will also be posted on the CYA's website. Lastly, before we get in our discussion, CYA would appreciate your feedback, your suggestions, your comments, so please send those to our development officer, Mr. Vasilis Simopoulos. You can see his email on the chat box below. The topic of our distinguished speakers today is none other than that of our global shared experience of the management of a pandemic in a historical perspective. From classical Athens to Greece's War of Independence in the early 19th century, we will look at the differences, but also at the many similarities in the ways humanity has tried to overcome those times of crisis. I would like now to pass the mic to our first speaker, Professor Nanno Marinatos, where he will be discussing how Periclean Athens managed the plague of 429 BC. Professor Marinatos, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, both Rosa and Alexis, for your introduction. Am I heard well? Is the voice clear? Excellent. So without further ado, I start. In 430 to 429 BCE, Athens was struck, as we all know, by a major infectious illness, which I'm not going to try and identify, but the Greek word is limos, loimos. which illness decimated its population and which is described with great precision and insight by the historian Thucydides. I want to remind you, these are all well-known facts, but just to remind you, the city was at war at the time, and in fact, the very time when the plague struck, it was subject to an invasion by Sparta, so the population had to be confined within the city walls, and that made things much worse. Now, our recent experience with the coronavirus has revived interest in Thucydides' description of the plague, and several articles have been written in newspapers, in magazines, in scholarly journals. There have even been teleconferences and webinars like ours today. But this seminar today will be different because I'm not going to focus on the illness itself, nor am I going to focus on Thucydides' description of it, but on the management of the crisis by the city of Athens. And I will be asking the following question. Did the administration of Pericles' time do nothing to contain the disease? And having raised the question, I doubt that the answer would be negative, namely that they did nothing. But it's strange that Thucydides is completely silent on this matter, I think because he took it for granted, so he focused on other things. And as Professor Veremis, who will follow me, will show in his own presentation, the administration of the much poorer Greece of 1828, right after the liberation, dealt with the same issue quite sufficiently, quite efficiently perhaps. So let me explain a bit more why I have faith in the administration of Athens in Pericles' time. I remind you facts that are well known to all of us, that they ran a sizable empire in the middle of the 5th century, that they organized major festivals, performances, that they arranged highly successful colonizing expeditions abroad, conducted wars, and they conducted public works on the Acropolis, which of course we all know. They possessed one of the most efficient military and naval machinery of Greece, second only to Sparta. Is it possible that Athens had no plan and no tools to control the disease? To provide some possible answers, I will be using Thucydides' account, but from this particular angle, and will be paying particular attention to his own understanding of the nature of infectious diseases. And I will be wondering how much of this knowledge was his alone and how much of it was shared with others. Frankly, I doubt that Thucydides was a hermit, living apart from the ruling elite of Athens and keeping his thoughts and observations to himself. On the contrary, it is likely that he himself had an active career in the administration of the city. Why? Let me explain why I propose this. It is rarely noted in connection with his account of the plague that he was elected to the highest office, the highest distinction in the Athenian democratic system, only 5 years later. So if he was deemed so competent to run an expedition as a general in 424, the possibility that he was involved 5 years before, when the plague struck in the administration, is very high. And if so, he must have taken part in the debates and in the discussion of how to manage the plague. How could he not? I do stress again that he was a member of the elite ruling class. I will next take a look at what Thucydides reports about the illness in order to show how much he understood about epidemics. And I will make 5 observations which are relevant. First, Thucydides notes that the disease came from far away, from Ethiopia, present-day Sudan, and that it entered Athens through the port of the Piraeus. This means that he knew that the illness could travel by ship, and he probably made the obvious association with a live host, human or animal. As you know, mice travel very well in ships. This understanding of migration of microorganisms over long geographical distances is especially important. And of course, we think of the present epidemic and how it has moved from China to the rest of the world. So that was my first observation. Number two, the second observation. Thucydides rejects the popular notion at the time that the Spartans had poisoned the wells intentionally so as to spread the disease to their enemies. Thucydides doesn't buy that, and he rejects the notion on the basis of reason. He says there are no natural wells or fountains in the Piraeus, so this couldn't have been the Spartans' fault. There is therefore an understanding on his part that the disease was infectious. Indeed, Thucydides says explicitly that it spread from person to person. He says, and I quote, "The crowding of the people who had moved from the country into the city aggravated the misery." And he also says, "Appalling too was the rapidity with which men caught the infection, dying like sheep if they attended one another." So if they came into contact with one another, they died. That was the second observation. Observation number three. He understands that the infection travels within the body. So it migrates in the body itself. Now, as we now know, the viruses and the germs do in fact enter through the mouth and the eyes. As the infection migrates within the body, it produces high fever and high inflammation, which cause unquenchable thirst, and Thucydides speaks of a desire to plunge into the water to alleviate the fever, the heat. We also know nowadays that the coronavirus becomes deadly, not at first when it is up on the head, but as it reaches the organs, the heart and the lungs. Observation number four. Thucydides says that he and others who caught the disease and survived did not get reinfected. Therefore, he recognizes immunity. And my last observation, number five, Thucydides says that scavenger animals would not come near corpses. And this means that he realized, and other Athenians too, that corpses were a source of infection. Now, considering these 5 points, we conclude that Thucydides had knowledge of many, if not all, the properties of infectious diseases. So now I return to the question, what did the administration of Athens do about it? And if you think about it in this way, an obvious answer would be to isolate the infected and prevent the illness from spreading further. And I will be returning to this point shortly. As well, collection and burning of dead bodies was an important part of the process. And I suspect that this collection and burning was organized by the state, because Thucydides does mention pyres, in Greek, pires. He does mention pyres, but he also complains of the difficulties that people had in managing the burials because of the quantity of the bodies. And I quote what he says, "When one man had raised a funeral pile, others would come and throw their own dead first and set fire to it. Or when some other corpse was already burning, before they could be stopped, would throw their own dead upon it and depart." So obviously there was some unruliness occurring, and of course one has to wonder who enforced the measures in the state. Now there was a body of officials, archons, who were responsible for the order of the city, but they must have had help of special forces, Scythians, Scythes in Greek, whom Aristophanes mentions as the Athenian police. Perhaps even the army was employed, that is, the hoplites created a special force. So this would be one measure. Another measure that the administration would have taken would be to recruit doctors, healthcare professionals, and volunteers Thucydides does mention such healers with a regretful comment that their willingness to help often resulted in them catching the illness themselves. If the state officials understood immunity as Thucydides does, they might have insisted on engaging people who had already contracted the disease and had survived. Let me quote Thucydides: "For a while, physicians, in ignorance of the nature of the disease, sought to apply remedies, but it was in vain, and they themselves were among the first victims, because they oftenest came into contact with people." So now the next question, which I have postponed until the end, is this: where would the sick be isolated? Where could they be isolated? Remember, and quarantined, because remember that the space within the city was very, very small. Now, special mention is made by Thucydides of sanctuary spaces, which were occupied by those infected. And I suggest that the city administration would have encouraged such an occupation, because in this way the sick could be contained within a particular space. The temenos of Olympian Zeus, for example, would have been a very suitable space, and it's a fairly large one. But there is a glitch there that maybe at that time it was outside the city walls, but there were other sanctuaries inside the city. Think of the Pision or Hephaestion, and many smaller sanctuaries around the Acropolis. And then there was the cemetery of the Keramikos, which could be used as well. Now let me read you what Thucydides says. The sanctuaries in which they lodged, so he very clearly says that they lodged there, in tents, were full of corpses of those who died in them. So we have an explicit mention of that. Now for the end, what I have not mentioned so far is the role of religion, about which Thucydides is highly skeptical. And before we discuss what he says, let me turn to Sophocles, the tragedian, who describes the same plague, and I want to emphasize this, that it's the same plague as Thucydides. So, when the play opens, Sophocles' play, Emeritus declares that incense is burning everywhere, and that every person has lit incense, is burning incense at the altars of the gods, wherever they would find. But Oedipus complains that he sees no results, even after the supplication, and therefore he takes the initiative to turn to the ultimate authority, namely Delphi, and ask Apollo for his help. We all know the rest of the play. Apollo says that one single person is responsible, because this person is polluted by having committed a terrible crime. His pollution has infected the entire city, and he must be expelled. Now, the religious and conservative approach of Sophocles forms a very stark contrast to Thucydides' scientific method, to which the modern reader is most sympathetic. I think that Thucydides may be almost polemical against the poet, because Thucydides says that no supplication in sanctuaries helped, no prophecy helped, wherever it was sought. The religious rites and prophecies are not as useless as Thucydides says, and as they seem to our eyes in our scientific age. But think of it. By giving a reason why the plague has occurred, you give also the possibility of healing. Apollo helps a great deal in the management of the psychological crisis, because if one guilty person is found, one guilty person, the rest of the community will be saved. At least they think so. And so I believe that religious consultation was a clever way to psychologically manage the crisis, and the state did not discourage it for exactly that reason. After all, they needed to build up the morale of the city, and that's part of crisis management. Namely, you must try to spread optimism. So it's time now to summarize my results. I have argued that Thucydides' understanding of the disease reflects, to some degree at least, the knowledge of the Athenian administration at the time of Pericles. Being neither ignorant nor disorganized, the Athenian state most likely attempted to manage the plague by following many of the practical rules that we employ today. They understood contagion, they tried to isolate the sick and care for them in basic ways. They understood immunity, and they understood the benefits of caretaking in basic ways. They also understood psychological management of crisis. But in the end, the disease stopped its lethal course only when it killed many. It completed its cycle, and the immunity of the herd was achieved at a huge cost, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Marinatos. That was a fascinating account of the plague crisis management during the Periclean era. What I found particularly fascinating is the role of ports and the role that ports played traveling by sea. That was the major vehicle for the spread of the disease, pretty much like today in our globalized world and in our interconnected world, if you may. It seems that human mobility, which is an essential characteristic of humanity, has always been interwoven with risks, and in our particular case, with health risks. Before we go to our next speaker, I would like to remind each one of you that questions can be submitted using the chat box at the bottom of your screen. And I would like now to pass the mic to Professor Thanos Veremis, who will be discussing how people handled plagues during Greece's War of Independence. Professor Veremis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Now, ladies and gentlemen, and fellow quarantined people of the United States and Greece, the only thing I can say about the 19th century is that not much had evolved since the times that Nanno mentioned. People were still very much afraid of the plague. We recall that saying by Shakespeare when about the two houses in Romeo and Juliet, a plague to both your houses, he says. So the plague was probably the worst thing that could happen to any society, and not much had been learned except for keeping people away from each other. Those who had it should not contract, should be quarantined in some way or another, isolated, and therefore prevent others from contracting the disease. But they didn't know anything about the mechanics of the disease. They didn't know anything about microbes yet. It took a long time before humanity learned about microbes. They knew, however, about fleas, for instance, concerning the bubonic plague, which was the worst plague that humanity ever discovered. But by the 19th century, the bubonic plague was not a major problem anymore. It had somehow simmered down, so to speak. There were other plagues, however, and one of the more frequent plagues during the Greek War of Independence, 1821, 1830, so to speak, was typhoid fever. Typhus was very well known in the Peloponnese, especially. We come across the typhus fever of 1822, mainly because a great memoir writer, Fotakos, gives full account of how it appeared and what it did, mainly because he had his own experience of typhus. He contracted typhus in Nafplion, which became the capital of Greece after the outbreak of the War of Independence. And he gives a full account of how he felt when he discovered that he had typhus. For one thing, high fever. And high fever created delirious situations. A person became delirious. He saw things that did not exist. He even opened the window and jumped out, hoping to land in the sea and cool his fever, but instead he landed in the sidewalk. So people had to be both interned and their windows nailed so that they wouldn't open and jump out. He gives a full account of how he felt. In fact, he gives us also some details which I've asked doctors of today, and they said that they make sense, that this high fever can cause problems in hearing, the hearing condition of the patient, and also of his memory. He said his memory was blurred for at least a month after the fever had gone. His fever lasted for 28 days, which is quite a long while. And he gave a full account of what happened in Nafplion in those days, which is quite horrific because many people died not so much from the fever itself as from the delirium that it caused. And many, especially many Philhellenes who could not communicate with the locals, and the locals thought that they were demonized, that they were under the spell of Satan, and didn't go close to them. So many died out of ignorance, the ignorance of the locals. But as I said, Fotakos, which is the name of this great historian of the times, Fotakos or Photios Chrysanthopoulos was his full name, says that even churches had to close, which is interesting. That reminds us of some of our present day, let's say, account with the church. But in those days, people apparently were much more wiser to the effect of putting too many people in a closed space, so much they understood, and churches had to close down, and people prevented from living next to each other and therefore making the plague grow. We know of another famous general of the Turks, Dramalis, who died of typhus in Corinth. Soon after the Dervenakia affair with Kolokotronis and Ikitaras and all the heroes of the War of Independence, Dramalis took refuge in Corinth, and apparently he died from the typhus there. We know that some of his soldiers had to flee the city because there were 15 or 20 dead a day per day. So they panicked and left, as so many others had in the past. On the one hand, there was a certain way of controlling the extending of the fever and the sickness, but on the other hand, many people lost their cool, so to speak, and took to flight, and that didn't help at all. But what they did was to try and reach Patras, which they did eventually after fighting their way to Patras and losing many, a number of people on the way. But it gives us an account of what happens when the plague hits a populated city, as Corinth was in those days. So we have an account of what happened on many occasions. Another case was the plague. In this case, it was a bubonic kind of plague, although not as strong as it used to be in medieval times when 1/3 of Europe's population disappeared in a century. In the 13th century, I think, 1/3 of European population just vanished in a year. But by the 19th century, the bubonic plague was not as strong as it used to be. It seems that plagues also have their day, and then they wither away and they give their place to other plagues. A very steady form of, I wouldn't call it plague, but illness, sickness, was malaria. Malaria is a constant state of affairs in Greece of the 19th century. Most Greeks of the Peloponnese, and especially Greeks who lived in valleys, suffered from the sickness of mosquitoes. It's passed on by mosquitoes, as you might have learned. And it tends to be very, very persistent in many parts where still water could be found. So the idea of clearing the marshlands throughout the 19th and 20th century changed that state of affairs radically in Greece. There's very little malaria, if any, left. But I recall my father, who left Greece early 20th century for the United States. And he had suffered malaria once, and it was a recurring state of affairs. He went to Chicago, and once every now and then he had an attack of malaria. In other words, a shivering in his bed. He was, what's the term? He hydrotas, whatever. And that held on for years and years, especially when he was younger. Then quinine, of course, takes care of that to a certain degree. So the combination of drugs and the clearing of marshlands made the difference in Greece. But this was really, truly a much more persistent illness than either typhus fever or certainly bubonic plague, with a bubonic plague, which was more of an old affair of the world. What does this mean for a society when it's hit by the plague? Mainly, it disrupts all its activities, its normal activities, and especially trade. Trade is hard hit by plagues. People are not willing to go out and travel. They stay at home, as they are advised to do. And many places appear, especially in Epirus under Ali Pasha. Mind you, Ali Pasha was an awful tyrant, but he was also a very capable administrator of Epirus. He founded several places of quarantine, and as soon as the plague appeared, he managed to put people there for as long as it took for the plague to go away. So people did know how to handle the plague, minus, of course, drugs. Drugs made a big difference, but at least they knew how to organize society and how to organize the keeping the plague at bay. The same is true for later on, for years, the years of the War of Independence, and Capodistrias, who was by far the better educated of all the leaders of the Greek War of Independence. Mind you, he was the last in the line of leadership, and he did manage to keep the War of Independence free of the plague, in the sense that he did manage to organize the last few battles, as was the Battle of Petra, under the leadership of Dimitrios Ypsilantis in Viotia, by evading the plague, which was somewhere nearby, but not quite where the battle occurred. So people were wiser than we might think. Their years of knowledge of the plague was certainly there. They didn't, of course, they had no idea of how to deal with microbes. They didn't even know the principle of microbes giving people the plague. What people apparently did know was, for instance, the bubonic plague, which was the worst of the lot, was carried by fleas that lived in the fur of animals. First, the Mongols, who came riding on their ponies from Central Asia, brought the plague to the Black Sea. The fleas of the animals, of the ponies, migrated to rodents, to mice in ships, and then were shipped to the major harbors of the Mediterranean, including Constantinople, Smyrna, and then across the sea to Nafplion. So we had a series of outbreaks of the bubonic plague, the worst by far of all the plagues. And we know why, and people of that time did know why, but they couldn't do anything except burn the bodies, as Nanno mentioned about the Athenian plague. I'm not sure that the Athenian plague, and I'm sure Nanno doesn't know either, whether it was a bubonic plague or a typhus fever or some form of that variety of typhus rather than the bubonic plague. Again, we don't know that much, I guess. So to come back to our times, the plague practically disappeared with antibiotics. That was the end of it. But we are always surprised by nature and by the transformation of microbes and how they turn into something different than what they used to be. In our case, it's the coronavirus. We are trying to find the remedy, but we still have not come up to that. What we know so far and what we do is not very different from what the people in Athens of the Thucydides days did, or the people in Corinth of the days of the Greek War of Independence. We try to keep far from each other and in quarantine, in a state of quarantine, to avoid the spreading of the illness. But more than that, so far, we can't do much. And certainly we should not inject ourselves with, what was it that President Trump suggested? Some form of something we put in swimming pools, I think, to kill the microbes, whatever it is. So there you are. Here we are again, facing a plague we don't know much about, hoping by the end of this year, we will be better acquainted and we will be able to rid ourselves from this enemy. But it seems that much is ahead which we cannot foretell yet. So with that happy note, I will depart and thank you for listening to what I had to say.
Thank you so much, Professor Veremis. That was really engaging. What I found fascinating is that despite the many similarities that you pointed out, it seems to me that there is some differences in the model of management in the sense that in the ancient times, but also in the medieval times, at least to my knowledge, the practice was to isolate people or to a certain extent in designated areas, whereas in more modern times, like the 19th century, ideas like lockdown or the quarantine, for example, as it happened in Hydra, start to emerge. And it seems to me that what emerges is the different management in the sense of a blanket control in the circulation of bodies and the circulation of people. And that requires perhaps a central state to happen. But I think I will go over to some of the questions we have coming in. This is a question for Professor Marinatos, but I think it is a question that could be very relevant to Professor Veremis as well. It is from Susan Samplimer, who asks, how did the administration notify the public about what was going on at the time? And I think that's relevant both for the 5th century, but also for the 19th, because we don't live in the era of social media, for example, as today. Professor Marinatos, would you like to tell us something about it?
I would like to speculate. I suppose through meetings in the Agora, through public meetings, since the democracy operated by meetings. There were lots of public meetings and announcements. If they wanted to avoid crowds, which evidently they had a knowledge that crowds are bad, they could also send a man on a donkey making announcement like the Greek, during the Ottoman occupation, we had the delalives, people who would just make announces very loudly. But I suppose there were some public meetings where people were informed. and kept in the loop, because that was part of the mentality of the democracy.
Thank you. Professor Veremis, what about the 19th century?
Well, you cannot compare the Athens of Pericles in terms of administration and capability of its leadership with the people in the Greek War of Independence in the Nafplion plague. Obviously, Athens of Pericles was much more advanced in every sense and in the sense of organization of society. But Nafplio didn't do that badly. I'm not sure it was the same plague, but nevertheless, they did manage to keep it to a small, let's say, outbreak. It was up to the leadership of the time. And as I said, Capodistrias did a much better job in organizing the war against the plague. What he did was very wise. He set Coletis, who was a doctor after all, and a doctor who had studied in France, in Toulouse, if I'm correct, and he put him in charge of Spetses, and Spetses only lost 15 people, which wasn't much given what the plague could do. So I think it really has to do with leadership. Capodistrias was a very capable person. He did a much better job than any of the people in 1822, but still they did well given the state of affairs of Greece then.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Let's go to another question, which I think is relevant to both our speaker from Steve Gatwick. The question is, as plagues are both ancient and modern, what can we learn from the past and today should another plague develop in the future? What are the impacts on globalization and what are the impacts locally? Professor Marinatos, would you like to start with the question?
I would say that personally, the main thing I have learned is self-discipline. You have to have self-discipline, and you have to respect rules that will keep you safe and keep others safe. Does that sound convincing?
Thank you very much.
On a personal level, that's what I have learned. Yeah.
Professor Veremis, what are your thoughts?
There isn't much more to add to what Nanno said. I think it's mainly a question of self-discipline and the credibility of the leaders. Mm-hmm. If a leader is credible, people tend to follow. If he is a menace to society, they do not. So in our case, I think there was much credibility in the leadership, and therefore things turned out much better than we expected, and much better than most Europe expected from Greece. Greece has become a kind of success story in the handling of the coronavirus. So let's hope that we keep to what we've achieved so far.
Let's go to another question by Douglas Olcott, who asked, does anyone have information about plagues during the Byzantine period? What do we know? Have we got any sources of what was happening then? Professor Veremis, would you like to start this time?
Oh, yes, it wasn't different to what we've described so far. In fact, probably worse in the sense that in Byzantine times, the bubonic plague was at its peak. We had many cases where Istanbul, Constantinople, of course, in Byzantium, was devastated by plagues, and the bubonic plague, the worst of all plagues. We're talking about 200,000 dead in one case. 200,000 dead in those days is the equivalent of millions today, because cities were not as large as they are. Constantinople was a big port, probably the biggest in Europe for a while. I think Constantinople was the first in size in the 12th century, 11th century, and Naples, strangely enough, was number two. And these are the two largest ports, and also the 2 ports struck by the plagues repeatedly, mainly because of the number of ships that came into these ports, bringing the plague.
Professor Marinatos, any thoughts about that?
I was thinking, I really know nothing about plagues and illnesses in the Byzantine period, but following Professor Veremis' lead on leadership, I was thinking how terribly efficient Oedipus is in the Oedipus play in Sophocles. We always tend to see the play from the point of view of myth, of mythology, who is guilty, who isn't guilty, why did he do that, why did he sleep with his mother? But in fact, he's a very efficient man, and he gives the impression that he knows what he's doing. And so a leader has to do that. They have to appear as though they are in control for the psychological management.
And he persists in trying to learn the truth,
Yes.
which is interesting. Although Tiresias is trying to avoid telling him what the situation is, because Tiresias knows that Oedipus is responsible for what is going on. And he says, forget it, I will not tell you. And he turns against Tiresias and he tells him that famous play of words, which is Ise tiflos ta tota ton tenun ta tomati. He plays with ta ta ta, and which is fantastic. And Tiresias then turns sour and he says, okay, I'll let you know, and he begins telling him more or less what the situation is.
I will take one more question. We have 5 more minutes. So before I pass it over to Mr. Phylactopoulos for the concluding remarks, I will take one question by Mary Praise. And she asked, how do we know that the virus originated in Ethiopia? And did it affect trade or racial relations? I think that goes both for the ancient times and both for the 19th century. How do we know that actually viruses came from those particular regions? And did that have an effect on how people started seeing others at the time? Professor Marinatos?
Yes, that's an excellent question, actually, which I hadn't considered. How did Thucydides know? And it's a very important question because it shows you that they did do tracking. They tried to do tracking. And I suppose one way they could do this is by investigating people that had traveled around and got a course of events. Where did it originate? Where did it first? Where was it noticed? Where did it go next? And that's the best thing I can come up with. That they did some tracking.
Thank you. Professor Veremis, any thoughts?
I think we can track the route of ships. Ships brought grain into Greece from the Black Sea. So a ship normally would start off from some port at the Black Sea, would go into Constantinople, then Smyrna, and from there, maybe much later in the 19th century, to Syros, and from Syros to Athens. Mind you that Syros had quite a few number of plagues, by the way, brought by the ships from the east. And we know that people had a full view of what to do when the plague hit the island. Again, they did more or less what we do today. Quarantine. There was a huge quarantine structure where sailors and others who came with the ships had to stay for a month or maybe more. And therefore, we know what happened at least in the 19th century and the mid 19th century. But the route was well known. It was the Black Sea, and from there to Nafplion, the grain importer of the East. Greece had to live by import of grain. There was very little in Greece to cover the needs of the people, and we know the route or whatever of the ships who came from there.
Well, one last thing. Were there any lasting cultural or financial implications stemming from the plague?
Of course, the plague was also always a source of disruption of the economy, of life, of practically everything. It was the worst thing that could happen, but it happened much too often. Today, it's a rarity. We say, oh, the coronavirus. After the war, we hadn't seen anything like it. And now we are aghast of what's going on. In those days, it was every 4 or 5 months, there was some form of plague, not always of the same strength, but nevertheless, people lived with the plague.
I see. Professor Marinato, was that the case in the ancient world as well, that kind of frequency?
No, not that I know of, and it's not reported in this way. I mean, obviously, the Athenian plague was exceptional. But you asked, Rosa, about the effects. Well, Thucydides reports that it decimated a whole generation, and that's a very extremely heavy price to pay. Because 10 years later, or 15 years later, he reports that now a new generation has grown up. So now we have an army again. So it decimated men around 30, around 25, an entire group. So that's really heavy. No, I don't think they were that frequent. If they were, there would be no Athens.
Well, thank you all for your questions, and thank you, Professor Marinatos and Professor Veremis, for participating in the CYA's virtual lecture series. I would now like to pass it over to Mr. Phylactopoulos for his concluding remarks. Mr. Phylactopoulos?
Thank you, Rosa. Well, I don't have any great words of wisdom after all we've heard, except to say that one thing impressed me was I was struck by Thanos's comment that the organization of society at the time of Pericles was much more efficient than at the beginning of the Greek state in 1830, which is an interesting comment. And then all I can say is, as the French saying goes, the more things change, the more they say the same. And what we can probably say is that, yes, these things come to us from the East most times, but they just travel much faster these days than they used to. Anyway, I want to thank the speakers for their great input today, and the moderator. And I want not to be accused of running on Greek time, so it is now exactly 1 hour after we started, and we would like to conclude this this session. Thank you all for participating. You gave us, there were about 90 of us attending after all, and it gives us courage to continue with this newfound activity. And we want to announce the next lecture. Well, we don't want to announce it yet. We want to keep that as a secret, but it's going to be on the 24th of June, a Wednesday again at the same hour. And we hope to see you then. You will be informed in due time, in due course, on the subject. It's going to be a fascinating subject again. So thank you very, very much. And I want to also say that this was a very much of a teamwork here at CYA. The various departments here put a hand in it, from the library to the media lab people, and of course under the direction of the Vice President for Academic Affairs. And most importantly, the one who organized all this was our development officer, Billy Simopoulos, whom I want to thank publicly for his contribution. Anyway, thank you very much all, and see you next time, June 24. Thank you.